Hello, everyone. Welcome to week one. I hope you enjoyed your long historical overview of the brief history of technology and war. A really, really fascinating read to see how things evolve over time. And I think Alex Rowland does a really fantastic job to give you so much information in a very digestible format. I also hope that you enjoyed the brief video analyzing Hollywood movies and understanding how we get it so wrong, especially in ancient and medieval warfare and siege warfare. What do? You dig a ditch. But that wouldn't make for good Hollywood TV. There's quite a few of those available on YouTube, so if you're interested, check some more of those out. But today we're talking about the introduction in Chapter 1 of Law, Science, Liberalism, and the American Way of Warfare, The Quest for Humanity and Conflict. This is by Stephanie Carvin and Michael John Williams. And this is a really important book for understanding and contextualizing the kind of uniqueness of the American way of warfare based on our unique history, time, and context. You know, and as the book says, each society and culture tends to have their unique view of warfare, which affects how they fight, and as a result, how they may be beaten. This is something important to remember. Assumptions you make that seem very obvious to you may be very different for another society, especially in the ways they think about war fighting, and warfare. A perfect example and kind of contrast today, the American way of war, I think you can see very distinct differences from the Russian way of war and the way in which they wage war in Ukraine, right? Two kind of very different things that we can talk about in the discussion. But how a country wages war affects who that country is and their military culture, right? This has a lot to do with identity. I think you kind of very much see in those of you who serve or know someone who serves as well, how much idea of military honor and virtue is kind of ingrained in U.S. society. You can't go to a sports game without the national anthem and without a type of flyover or some type of honoring the troops. That's not something you see in, I don't think, any other country, right? There's something unique about it, and it's very much ingrained in US identity. So I think more than the kind of classic definition that war is a continuation of politics by other means, which is important to remember, right? War is trying to reach a political outcome. It's not war just for war's sake. But I think there's more to it than that, and that's what they get at in the US context in this book. So a couple things I want you to think about as you go on throughout, and things that you can bring up in your discussion questions as well. How would you define the American way of war? What is a definition of it? I think one thing that stands out to me is the US priority of force protection. Now, what does that mean? The US doesn't want to see our troops getting injured or especially dying, right? This is a unique kind of culture of American losses during the Vietnam War. There was a big fear of troop losses and what that means for the kind of democratic public back home. Authoritarian regimes don't necessarily care as much if their soldiers are killed. You see kind of in Russia's war in Ukraine, hundreds of thousands, approaching 1 million battlefield casualties for them, right? That would never be tolerable in US society, right? And so you think about American way of war and how would you define it? How is it different from other cultures of war? I gave Russia for an example, but what about other countries? We talk about the Western way of war. So how would some of our allies define warfare? And how would some of our other adversaries define warfare, right? How would China fight a war? That's something very different than we might fight it, right? And we don't have as much empirical evidence for how China might fight. And what role does the law play in fighting wars, right? I think the US and especially our officer training military academies take a lot of pride in studying and understanding the laws of war and trying to cultivate that in US war fighting, right? Abiding by the laws of war, the rules of engagement, because it's not only important for who we are and our identity as a country that we follow the laws of war, but also for help with our soldiers, right? It's a lot easier to, as a soldier, dehumanize the enemy, right? It allows you to kill in battle something that you might have an aversion to, and yet makes it really difficult when you have to come home, right? So it's something to think about. Whereas if you follow kind of the laws of war and build up this internal ethics, you don't have what some in the ethics of war literature refer to as moral injury, right? That idea that your soul is damaged by having to take lives in war. So something really interesting to think about as we go on. So this is the central tension in the American way of war, right? On the one hand, you have this overriding sense of urgency to achieve a quick and decisive victory. You don't want battlefield losses. You don't want pressure from a democratic home. So you want quick and decisive victory. And on the other hand, you have restraint, that kind of idea of Enlightenment liberal values, individual rights, freedom, human rights, all of these things come in contrast with that, right? How do you annihilate your enemy while also being restrained? How do you win quickly and decisively, that unconditional surrender, while still holding on to your identity as a country that values individual liberty, human rights, these type of liberal, classical liberal, like John Locke, founding principles of individual rights and liberty. And so the way in which Americans, especially in war fighting, have traditionally squared that circle is embracing science and technology, right? The idea that technology itself and technological innovation will make us more ethical in warfare, right? It's kind of getting at that central dilemma and saying that technology will solve this problem. You may hear this kind of in the news and things like that today, that, and we'll talk about it later on in the semester with drone warfare, right? The idea that drones are so accurate and so precise that they only kill the bad guys, right? It gives you this sense that not only are we getting quick and decisive victories, we're not taking any civilian casualties, right? And there's some issues with that that we'll unpack later on in the semester. But that's something that you've probably heard in popular culture, where you can see a concrete example of how we embrace technology to show that we are ethical in warfare. So technology does claim, and many US officials throughout history, as you see in here, inventors of these technologies, as well as you'll see in the next chapter in Law, Science, and Liberalism, claim that we are solving these moral dilemmas by developing more lethal, precise weapons. You'll also see past arguments where if you make war so horrific, like with the invention of nuclear weapons or other types of super weapons, that war will become impossible, right? There's this delusion that if war becomes so horrific, then the world will know peace. So since that didn't come true in World War I and World War II, there's a new way in which to think about the American way of war. And that is that a humane war is possible. You can solve this moral dilemma. You can defeat your enemy without having to accept mass casualties on your side or civilian casualties on the other side. And that can also be a driver of US willingness to use force. So for example, drone warfare. US engaged in drone warfare in Yemen, Pakistan, and Somalia, basically from 2002 until about 2019, right? Well into the first Trump administration. And I don't think it's hyperbole to say that the US would not be willing at a time after Iraq, Afghanistan, and longest wars in history in the US, that we wouldn't be willing to commit troops on the ground in Yemen or Pakistan, right? But this technology enabled the US to use force outside of declared war zones in order to target terrorist networks that didn't operate in the traditional nation state sense. So what are the kind of implications for a democratic society when you have something like risk-free warfare, right? It's not psychologically risk-free for those who are piloting these vehicles. A lot of really fascinating studies in recent years looking at PTSD amongst drone pilots, as well as that kind of strange disconnect that you have that, you essentially drive to work, you operate a drone on the other side of the world, you may follow someone for a while, take them out with a Hellfire missile, and then you've got family texting you to pick up the kids from soccer practice, and then you go home. So it's this real psychological strangeness of blurring the home front and the war front that takes place here, even though our soldiers are insulated from physical risk and danger while operating these on U.S. soil. So really, really fascinating dilemmas, I think, that this highlights. So a couple of crash courses real quick on the laws of war. We'll go into it a bit more next week, specifically on ethics of war. But the laws of war over time, as this book has demonstrated, have been formulated to privilege military necessity over humanitarian values, right? They are meant to constrain the absolute horrors of war, but not meant to tie your hands in war fighting. They're somewhat realistic or pragmatic in this sense, right? They're not saying that wars are never going to take place. They're trying to set about the rules in which they operate it. So the argument by Carvin and Williams is the U.S. strategically uses law to help it wage war, not restrain it. So it may restrain it in the way in which it conducts war, but it also uses the law to help it wage war. So, for example, in the global war on terror, the U.S. argued that it could use military force anywhere in the world, wherever terrorists operate, so taking away that kind of geographical boundary of war, for as long as it takes, so the kind of temporal boundary of war as well. And in that war, prisoners of war were not referred to as prisoners of war because they would be afforded certain rights under the Geneva Conventions, but instead they were referred to as enemy combatants, right? So the way in which you kind of use law to your advantage so that you can take enemy combatants to Guantanamo Bay and used enhanced interrogation, another kind of hyperbole for torture. So you can see in which the ways rhetorically the law is used to help us wage war. And so the legal scientific way of war, as Carvin and Williams argue, is one that seeks to balance the need of overwhelming force and the legal humanitarian concerns through science and technology, right? So you even heard at the beginning of the Iraq War in 2003, Donald Rumsfeld talking about how precise our bombing technology is, that we could take out someone underneath a bridge without destroying the bridge, right? So this is constant appeals to this. And so you see outlined the kind of three periods of super weapons, right? So in the Great War, you have this delusion that, with the advent of air power, with tanks, all these things we're going to be studying quite quickly. Really, really fascinating, the first industrialized warfare. There's this belief that it must be fought as viciously and evilly as possible in order to make it end quickly. But as we know, it got drawn out into horrific trench warfare that killed hundreds and hundreds of thousands of soldiers. Then we get to the nuclear age, right? The idea that nuclear power and harnessing the power that we find in stars, that science finds a way of fighting to avoid a mutually assured destruction. This belief that nuclear weapons have solved the dilemma of major interstate or global conflict, and that nuclear deterrence is a way in which you can get around that. That the most horrific weapon ever invented can somehow prevent all future war. And we'll talk about this later on in the semester. And after Vietnam, COIN, or counterinsurgency, is out. So this idea that we got bogged down in a massive counterinsurgency warfare, focused too much on the metrics like body counts and other kind of scientific metrics, that we needed a quick and decisive victory, which the US gained in the first Gulf War. So just a kind of overview here to see the ways in which the laws of war also go along with kind of assumptions about what war will be like. Because throughout the semester, you're going to see it's as much about what you assume the future of war is going to be that leads you to certain tactics, doctrines, military innovations. But also your enemy has a say as well, right? And that's something important to consider. So looking through the kind of historical trajectory of warfare, you can see some of the kind of big differences. Greeks looked at the instrumentality of war, a technical problem to be solved with better tactics or technology, and the idea of citizen soldiers. So you can kind of see the Greek ideas permeating today with new technological innovation. The Romans, on the other hand, really systematized warfare and a total war of annihilation. Right? You talk about salting the earth so that nothing can grow there, absolute carnage and battlefields. And that ultimately the argument of the Romans was that the downfall of Romans was because they abandoned drill discipline and citizen soldiers. They relied too heavily on mercenaries and other conquered forces, etc. The Middle Ages was looking at siege warfare, so you just saw there was an avoidance of pitched battles. You close yourself into a castle and then draw it out as long as possible. But then the Enlightenment comes around, this idea of scientific enlightenment, Newtonian science, that somehow you can infuse the study of war with mathematical precision, that somehow war is an engineering or mathematical problem to be solved. If you just get the formula right, it will lead to quick and decisive and absolute victories. Right? It's a very appealing idea that science can solve these wars. And so you see this a little bit in some of the early Napoleonic wars, this idea of a clockwork military, right? Napoleon's opponents sought to maintain control and minimize uncertainty. Napoleon, on the other hand, engaged in a very new type of warfare. He reorganized and decentralized his army, right, to operate independently under greater uncertainty. So instead of having top-down command structures like all opposing armies at the time, they were a very fluid and agile force. They would operate independently with lower commanders taking control and not necessarily communicating with each other. So Frederick the Great of Prussia kept losing to this agile French force because he was trying to fight kind of traditional pitched battles, army versus army. And there's this great quote from Clausewitz as well that I think encapsulates this idea. The absolute, the mathematical as it's called, nowhere finds any sure basis in the calculations of the art of war. From the outset, there is a play of possibilities, probabilities, good luck and bad luck, which spreads about with all the coarse and fine threads of its web, and makes war of all branches of human activity like a gambling game, not gambling game. And so what he wants to say here is that, yeah, you can plan for whatever war you want, but it's not ever going to last your battle plans. Sometimes you just have bad luck. Sometimes a plague rips through your troops. Sometimes the battlefield is rainy at a day where it's disadvantageous to you, because war, like all human activity, is a bit of a gamble, right? Even if you prepare perfectly, sometimes luck is not in your favor. And so, is war an art or a science, right? The answer to this is obviously it's a little bit of both, but whether you assume it's one or the other has a major stake in your debate, because you organize your military based on this concept and you have certain core assumptions. And there are real implications for what you bet on, one or the other, right? If war is a science, you can really invest in technology, things like that. You see that in the kind of AI arms race today, right? Is AI going to be the future of war, or is it going to take us down the wrong path that's very easily destroyed or dissuaded or blocked against, right? These are bets that countries are making, and we don't actually know the outcome, right? We don't have the benefit of hindsight. But the thing that we do have, and what we hope to gain throughout this semester, is seeing across time how many technologies are hyped, right? That they're going to solve the ethical, the moral, the the military, the strategic dilemmas of warfare, and it never quite does, right? So I think that's something to keep in the back of your mind, and that's the usefulness of studying history, is understanding the ways in which we thought war would be in the past, how it actually ended up in the future, and then now looking back, what lessons we can learn from that. And so there's a big legal tradition in the Western way of warfare. So restraint exists even though war consists of killing, deliberately shedding blood of one's fellow creatures, always and everywhere, only killing done by certain authorized persons under certain specified circumstances in accordance with certain prescribed rules is saved from blame and regarded as praiseworthy. Right? So what this says is we differentiate. At time of peace, killing is considered murder. At times of war, it is considered just. Right? It is even praiseworthy. But with that, there are still certain conditions under which you can kill in war. For example, you don't kill medical personnel, you don't kill chaplains, you don't kill someone who has surrendered, etc. So there are still rules within war. But different societies at different times have differed greatly on where they draw that line between war and murder, both inside of war and outside in the everyday context. And so you'll see in this chapter as well, the Liber Code, the kind of first attempt at laws of war in General Orders 100. I actually recommend you kind of go read through these at some point in time. It's 157 articles in plain language distributed to US troops. And you can consider it the first modern military manual of an army. So really, really fascinating to kind of see the history of that and the first kind of codified rules of war in the US context, right? So that really tells you something about the value with which the US places on the laws of war. But of course, there are always limits. And the limits that you're going to be reading about next week, especially as you start a history of bombing, is who the laws of war are not applied to, and that is war against the savages. Anyone who you deem savage or barbarian, the gloves come off, and you kill civilian combatant alike without mercy, without moral qualm. So we'll go ahead and leave it on that happy note. I hope you enjoyed the readings this week, and best of luck on the quiz, and I look forward to reading your discussions.